picture. Israel is one of the last, if not the last, effort at what we call settler colonialism. Settler colonialism. That's when a group of people, sometime in the last 4 centuries, the history of capitalism, a group of people settle in a colonial territory. So the British government or the Dutch government or somebody else takes over some land, usually with military force, and then to make it a paying proposition. And remember, the goal in colonial situations was to make the colony pay for its own colonization. So, for example, the first book I ever wrote was about British colonialism in East Africa. And they made the people of East Africa grow coffee, the single most important product, Arabica coffee, grown in the highlands in the middle of Kenya. Okay, they needed labor, so they made the Africans live in reserved areas where they could not sustain themselves. There wasn't enough land. There wasn't enough place for animals. So the only way to survive would go to be and work on the coffee farm of the colonial British who came in, got the land for next to nothing, and were now provided with the labor and could sell their coffee back into London. Okay, so that was a settler colonialism. Australia is another one. New Zealand is another one. South Africa is another one. Canada and the United States are also. What you notice, though, in the list I just gave you, is that the settlers found themselves sooner or later in a oppositional position with the local population. And so what began to happen was the systematic destruction of those local people. So, for example, again, using my example of Kenya, it eventually produced in the early 1950s something called the Mau Mau Rebellion of Black Africans rising up against the British. And it forced the British out. A few years after that, even though they slaughtered huge numbers of African people, by that time it was over. They knew, and the British had to leave. Here in the United States, same thing. Ethnic cleansing is what the settlers eventually did. They destroyed, literally by mass killing, the native or indigenous people. The few that remain are still to this day stuck, many of them, on reservations where they can barely make a living. Indigenous Americans are among the poorest, the least healthy, the most riddled with crime and alcohol and all the rest. It became, after they were done, it became a new world in which ethnic cleansing and the slaughter of indigenous people was no longer celebrated. In the 17th, 18th, 19th century, the British thought they were bringing God and civilization and progress and modernity to India or to Pakistan or to fill in the blank. But nowadays, everybody not everybody, but almost everybody understands that that's not what was going on, that there was money being made. It was a standard joke in England that if you could not be successful in your career in England, you could always go to the colonies, and there you would become a gentleman farmer, because all the work was done by the masses in India and so forth, okay? The problem for Israel is that it's trying to do the same thing, but it's doing it too late. The world is not what it was. The balance of forces is not what it was. You can't do in the 21st century what was common in the 18th and 19th centuries. Nobody should be surprised at that. But there's deep in the Israeli population a sense of the hypocrisy of the British or the Americans or the Australians wanting them to make a deal. Well, they didn't make a deal. There's no two-state solution for the Maori people in New Zealand or the Aboriginal people in Australia or the indigenous people in the United States and Canada. Not at all. No two-state solution. They couldn't even vote in elections here until a few years ago. So they don't have most civil rights, and on and on and on. So that's the first problem. Israel is caught in a historic impossibility. The world will not tolerate what the Israelis are doing. The very people who did it themselves 200 years ago are now not willing to watch it unfold here. Yes, for the first few months, they all looked away and pretended they didn't have to, but now, and you know why? Because the rest of the world, the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the whole world watching this slaughter is horrified. You can't be telling anybody that they're bringing God or modernity or anything else. You are slaughtering the people in order to take the land. That's what it's about. And the rest of the world protests. And that makes it very hard for the Western world, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of them to pretend that they can be neutral. They can't. They can't. So that's the first problem. Israel's project is a historical impossibility. You cannot do it now. And wherever they draw the red line, whether it's going into the camp at Rafah, or whether it is, by the way, attacking a consulate in Damascus of the Iranian government without any provocation that anybody has been able to point to, just as an act of war in a non-war situation when you're already at war somewhere else. This is crazy stuff. And the world looks at it that way. And if they take the troops out of Gaza and put them against Hezbollah in the north and against Lebanon and so on, it'll be the same. You can't do this now. And the Israelis are discovering they can't. Mr. Biden has been pro-Israel all of his life. He collects huge amounts of money from pro-Israeli donors here in the United States. He has all his alliances built around that. And you could see what he did. He was 100% for Israel. Yeah, now he's 42% for Israel. Why? Has he changed his mind? Of course not. But he sees all around the world the signs of a changed situation. He miscalculates because he doesn't understand the big picture. You and I have discussed this. He miscalculated, and the people around him and the European leaders, they didn't understand what they were doing going to war against Russia. The war against Russia, they are losing that war. And there's no sign of changing. They have escalated over and over again. They would never send in tanks. They did. They would never send in surface-to-air missiles. They did. They would never send in F-15 fighter planes. They did. Now they will never send troops on the ground. They probably will. None of it works. None of it works. Here's another sign. The whole world is supporting mostly Hamas, not Israel. Therefore, they miscalculated. They thought they could destroy Hamas. They can't. Every time they kill somebody, and they call everybody they kill Hamas, every time they kill somebody, 3 more people become Hamas because they saw their mother being killed or they saw their child being destroyed. You are creating more Hamas with every day. This is crazy. This is a policy that is self-destructive, but you can't see it in the minds of many in Israel. They can't see it any more than the Americans could see that the Russians could and would mount a serious war effort, and not just serious militarily, but serious politically, serious diplomatically, serious, ideologically. They miscalculated. Those are the 2 major wars right now, Gaza and Ukraine, and the West miscalculated both of them. And no, those are not isolated incidents. They miscalculated in Iraq. They miscalculated in Afghanistan. The Taliban run Afghanistan. It's very clear. And the biggest winner in the Iraq-Iran situation is Iran, who's supposedly an enemy. I mean, and you're not seeing any adjustment. They can't see what is happening. So the biggest problem is a change in the world that these people have set themselves against. And if a relatively small group of people, Israeli Jews, are a small number, whatever it is, 6 million, 8 million, whatever the number is, but they're not strong enough to take on the whole world. And it's an illusion and a delusion for them to imagine that they can do that. They can't do it militarily. They can't do it economically. They can't do it politically. They can't even subdue the people of Gaza. And Mr. Biden miscalculated even in his own country. He thought that this country would be unanimously pro-Israeli. Not true. To the surprise of many, and I admit I'm one of them. I'm surprised at the amount of American sympathy for Gaza, for the Palestinians, including many American Jews, many. And Mr. Biden is therefore confronted with having insisted we're with you 100%, and now he has to retreat. It's going to hurt him in the election. It's going to hurt him a lot. He may still win, but he is worried. That's the only reason he is telling Mr. Netanyahu, you better adjust. And Mr. Netanyahu is talking, I'm sure, to Mr. Trump.